Alright, so there may be quite a few reasons why you're struggling to make your combats interesting and fun for your players and for yourself. So today I kind of want to go over all the different reasons why maybe your combat isn't meeting up to the expectation that you have and your players have, and how you can kind of elevate your combat to make it more interesting. My name is Wyatt, I'm here with Dungeon Inspiration, and today we're really going to be diving into why combat is fun and how you can make your combat more fun for you and your players. Alright, and so with that out of the way, there's a couple of reasons why you may be struggling to have your combat be interesting. And this comes back to, why are you running your combat? There are three major reasons that your combat may be struggling, why you may be running it. The first is because you feel like you have to run the combat. The second reason is because it's part of your plot, so you have to have this combat and you feel like you're railroading your players. And the third reason that you may be having this combat and having this problem is because your party's just trying to level up. They're not really fighting for your story, but they're just trying to get to that next level milestone to go to the next place in the campaign. And all three of these have very different answers to them on how you can actually make that combat more interesting. The first one I want to start with is because you feel like you have to run a combat. One of the major reasons that people have issues with this is because they feel like they have to have combat. And today I'm here to tell you, you really don't actually have to have the combat. If you feel like you can't create an engaging story for the combat, then just skip out on it altogether. You can move on and do a puzzle or a dungeon or a different map exploration and use milestones to reward your players for actually going and completing these kind of mental gymnastics tasks, and that can be a lot more fun. There are a few other ways where you can also kind of incorporate into your story where you're not really having to do real combat, but they can kind of be tricky. Like stealth missions are a great one. You can kind of have your players kind of go in, sneak into a bar and get some information, or you could have your players dive really deep into marketing and all of these kind of weird little business things, get into the trading route, and you can reward them for these deep tasks as a whole party, having them kind of go off and trade and start a business, and still have it progress towards your story and give them levels and rewards for that, where it's not going to feel quite as railroady. If the problem you're struggling with is that your party just really wants to level up, so they're trying to run monster after monster with no remorse for your story and just trying to get to that next level so they can get to the boss fight, there's actually a lot of different ways you can deal with this, and you're probably in one of the best situations to make your combat more fun. And the way that you can do this is simply by really theming those encounters. If you're going in and you're in a very heavily wealth-based area, you could have monsters that steal gold on attacks. There's plenty of them in the PHB, and also you can just kind of get into these nitty-gritty moments where, if you're in a dark realm, you could actually have shadows coming towards your players, which have lots of resistances and can be quite dangerous even though they have a CR of a half. The second thing that's kind of on your side for this kind of situation where your players are just kind of leveling up is, if you want to make these combats more fun and more interesting for the players and you, simply make them more deadly, make them harder encounters. Because if they're really hard encounters, they're going to be super interesting for you to run as a DM, because it's kind of the question of, oh my gosh, are they going to be able to do this? Are they not going to be able to do this? For your players, there's a lot more involved. There's a lot more thinking. It's going to be a really enjoyable fight without having any kind of problems, and you just have to really put more time into it. And the last way that I kind of want to mention where you can actually make your combats more interesting if your party's just trying to level up is you can actually take more intelligent monsters, even goblins, orcs, things like that, and you can actually have them almost have conversations with the enemies. You can have them cry out as they're being struck down. You can kind of go into those conversations, talk to them before and after the fight. If your players just knock them out, because they don't always have to kill them, you can actually start building bonds with those enemies while still giving the XP because they did beat the monster, and have more room for your campaign to continue to grow and evolve as time goes on. Because these kind of relationships that you can build and the identities for the different civilizations and monsters that they're fighting could be really interesting and can become a big focal point of your campaign, and it allows that combat to more seamlessly integrate into your story, which is probably the easiest way to spice up your combat and make it more fun, is make the combat really matter. The other thing you can kind of do is just giving your players the opportunity to actually interact with the world around them, make the world feel more lived in, like they're really there, And when they have the opportunity to go and try to negotiate with this bandit group that's been sitting on the road rather than having to just walk in and immediately get into a fight, that's a great way to do it. Now, if your players are kind of just in a dungeon and they're just crawling through the dungeon and trying to get as much damage and as much XP as possible, there's another way that you can kind of negotiate this. If you're not really having your players want to talk to the NPCs, you can actually go in and have those players get ambushed. You can have the monsters waiting for them. You can have abnormal amounts. Like if you're having a respawning dungeon and they keep going back and back in XP, there's a great way that you can deal with this where you're just having your players kind of go through the motions. And then all of a sudden there's this major mix up and there's some larger amount of monsters there, or there's a monster that's not supposed to be on that layer of the dungeon or in that portion, and it can make them ask a lot of questions and make that combat a little more interesting, and tends to be where more scary combats that you're not expecting, curveballs, are what really make them interesting. You can also toss in like little bits of world lore in there, little bits of kind of investigations in the combat. If they're fighting that bandit camp and the bandit camp is working for the king secretly, they could just see a letter that fell on the ground with the king's emblem in it. If they don't pick it up, they may miss out on a key piece of information, but also if they're grabbing it, then that combat feels a lot more fun and a lot more rewarding because there was actually a tangible value to that exact combat. So you're building value for the combat, which is really how you overcome this leveling problem where your party's just kind of trying to grind out the levels. The third kind of way that you can run your combat is if you're integrating it into your story. And this can be the hardest one because if you don't do it well, it can leave the combat feeling really, really boring because a boss that really doesn't do anything, it's just a stock boss, just a normal dragon, for example, that can get really uninteresting. In your story, there's a couple of different ways that you can kind of spice it up to make it interesting. That being said, when you have this problem, sometimes when combats aren't fun that are story-based, it's because at the end of the day, there was just no real thought behind how you were picking the abilities of the monsters. For example, in a lot of the pre-constructed campaigns, like for example, Rise of the Dragon Queen, there's these kind of moments where it feels almost wrong, where you're fighting a white dragon who's a named character from D&D and is known to have spells that allow him to burrow and hide and get into this area where he's almost scavenging and waiting and ambushing his prey, and he uses mind control spells and whatnot. That's all in lore, and it's in the story of D&D, and then when you get to it, it's just a normal ancient white dragon. That's going to be a pretty boring campaign because you're not bringing through any personality of your monsters, and you're not really fitting the longer theme of your campaign. If you're running a fight for the story and you're dealing with a greedy merchant, have him steal gold. If you're dealing with an ambushing white dragon, have it burrowed under the snow and have it try to charm one of your players into walking into its trap. If you are playing and you've got an elder lich towered up in a maze, rather than just having him do necromantic damage, have him kind of build a puzzle that's on the floor, and if you step on the wrong bricks as you try to come towards him, it poisons you. Adding these kind of flavor pieces in actually really helps you to make the combat more interesting. You can have a large zombie army that serves a lich, but every third zombie is actually just an illusion, and so your players kind of run through. And if your story is about a lich who used to be a human that was a mage that did a lot of trickery and a lot of magic, that can be a lot of fun and it adds flavor. So those were kind of all of the different things that I wanted to go through for this episode about how you can kind of spice up your combat and make it more interesting. That being said, we do have episodes on combat, how to use monsters, how to theme monsters, and theme your whole campaign over on Dungeon Master Inspiration, our podcast. It's hosted on this YouTube channel, and it's also available wherever that you listen to podcasts. I'll have a link for it down below. Make sure you check that out. It really does help the channel if you could consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It's going to help us grow so that I can produce more of this D&D content to try to help people answer their questions and kind of inspire others to make better campaigns.